So this class is called Awakening, the Master Key to All Problems. I'm going to tell a little bit about why I created this class and some of the things that we'll learn in this class, and also the general structure of it before we go into the actual first class. So I created this class because I was noticing that generally people, myself included, tended to operate with adopted information. And what do I mean by adopted? It's like through the process of being a kid and growing up, we didn't have good reasoning at, say, 2 years old. And so there was someone there to always tell us, some parent or guardian, to say, this is right and this is wrong. This is good and this is bad. And as we grow up and maybe we're 4 years old, 6 years old, this is still very necessary. 8 years old, 10 years old, maybe we're getting a little bit better at this point, but still very necessary. And then 12 years old and so on, we get better at reasoning as we get older, but due to this necessity of being told all the right ways of doing things, and all the wrong ways of doing things, and all the good things, and all the bad things, we've adopted tons of thoughts and beliefs that just are not from our own reasoning. And so we become an adult and we move into the world. And oftentimes we're still looking outside of ourselves for the answers. Still go to maybe church, and at church the preacher is super happy to tell you what to believe and what to do and what to think, how to behave. There's many other organizations out there that are happy to tell you what to do, what to think, what to believe. And all with very good intentions. But the only thing about these good intentions is they're only meant to be guidelines. There's no way any guideline could know all the little intricacies and all the dynamics and all the parts of a particular situation to be able to tell you how to act in that situation, to be able to tell you what to think in that situation, to be able to tell you what to do in one specific situation. And so we notice this in our lives. We notice that pain comes up in situations. Confusion comes up in certain situations. And this is an attempt to be using some of those beliefs, some of those guidelines that have been passed down to us with good intentions when it won't currently work in the present situation due to it not including enough factors in the reasoning. So that's why I created this class. I noticed for myself and in my own experience that there were so many areas that I was doing things based on not accounting for enough of the facts within the present situation. And as I began to do this, I began to notice just how many beliefs I had been using that was literally creating the pain and the confusion. And as I began to really, really reason for myself, I began to see just how many things were surface level reasonings that had come from very early age when I couldn't reason for myself and I needed someone to tell me. exactly what to do, exactly what to think, exactly how to behave. So these surface level reasonings are in all of us. And I'm going to go over a few of these surface level reasonings as an example of some of the things that we'll cover in this class later on down the road. For example, control. We have a very exaggerated belief in the amount of control that we as a person actually have. And this over-exaggerated control is in our thinking, the way it believes things should be instead of the way they are now, the ways that it believes we should have behaved instead of the way that we did behave, and the way we believe that others should have behaved instead of the way they did behave. And so we're going to unravel control in this class, actually, and also cause. We also have an over-exaggerated belief in cause, thinking that if there's one person or one thing that's the cause of something. But this, once again, is just the most limited way of viewing cause, a limited way of interpreting our experiences. And so both of those, control and cause, we're going to go over more in this class after we cover the basics here. Some of the other beliefs, though, that we're going to cover in the subsequent classes on down the line are things like right and wrong. We're going to go into how right and wrong, once again, is just the most limited interpretation, and we can expand out to see broader dynamics that is inclusive enough to understand that right and wrong doesn't make any sense to use. And good, bad, same thing. And then in another class, we're going to go over gain, loss. How this idea we interpret, oh, I lost something here, or we interpret, oh, I gained something here, is once again just the most limited interpretation based on what had been given to us at a much younger age. Due to our limited capacity to reason, it was needed, these instructions and these thoughts were needed to be given to us in this way. Not only so we could move in the world at least a little bit as a youngster, but also not completely hurt and injure ourselves. So these were very necessary. And also as an adult, it's time to grow out of them and begin to see in what all other places, how many other places am I interpreting things in some of the most limited ways that have been given to me as a kid. So gain, loss is one of them that we're going to go into. Also opposites. In reality, nothing is opposites. This is just another most limited interpretation of a way to interpret our experiences. And whenever we go into each one of these, we gain a little bit more freedom each time. A little bit more fluidity in our thinking, which allows us to be more authentically ourselves. Because the second thing that this class is going to teach us, not only are we going to unravel those beliefs and more, and begin to give us the freedom, and the freedom comes from the second thing that this class will teach us, which is that we are none of those things. We are not thought. Even though conceptually some of us might know that, perhaps some of us haven't heard that before. Either way, whether we've heard it or not, we often still act as if we are thought. Otherwise, we wouldn't be playing out its ideas. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living what thought tells us. And so the other thing that we're going to learn in this class, the thing, is becoming awake to the awareness that we are before thought. And so the ways that we're going to do these things, both with unraveling these beliefs, which is so fascinating, and then also becoming the awareness that is just aware of all those things that are happening as who we truly are going to be done through the lessons. Super short, concise lessons, like 1 page, 1.5 page at the most. That is only one topic, one point of focus, in order to drive that one point home that is so life-changing that it needs to be the only focus. So there's no confusion in what the lesson is about. And then there are these practices that can go along with some of the lessons. And the practices are not something that's going to take up any time. You can make time for them if you want to. Or they are designed just to move about your day while doing this practice. And then the other little practice is going to be journaling. There will be different journal entries that you guys will get an opportunity to do on certain lessons. And in order to clarify what you actually think with your own reasoning. So that will be how this class moves. How this awakening class moves. And that's the general structure and the reason why I created it and some of the stuff that we'll learn. And feel free to hop in if anyone has any questions. We'll be moving on to the next part here. I know we got a lot of people, so questions might not be very easy to do. But I think that was pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so guys, the first thing that we're going to do is the first practice. And once again, this isn't necessarily going to take up any time in your days. It's just something that we can do all throughout the day. All the time, constantly. It can become the most important thing because of what we realize that it gives to us. And I've called this practice the awakening practice. And I deliberated in my head for a while, should I call it the awakening practice or should I call it the orientation practice? Because I think orientation is really super descriptive of what this exercise is. But in the orientation is the awakening. So I looked up the definition of orientation, and I think it's super fitting, so I'm going to read it to you guys. It says, the determination of the relative position of something or someone, especially oneself. Okay, so one of the key words is determination. Determining the relative position of oneself. So there are a few different things here. There is the determining, and then there's the relative positions to oneself. So typically we think oneself to be thought because we're so focused on it all the time. We also tend to think the body to be a oneself. We are also focused on it all the time. But this exercise, it gives us a chance to orient or determine ourself in a new way. So a chance to determine what are the relative positions to ourself. So first we're going to have to figure out what our self is. If it's not thought and the body, we're going to have to do that, and that's the focus of the exercise, to determine oneself. So if we're not thought and we're not the body, and this class is to awaken to who we truly are, then this awakening exercise to orient ourselves to our true nature, our true self, is the most important thing to learn how to do. So in the first week, all we're trying to do is determine the orientation. What are the parts? There's thought, there's the body, and if those are the relative positions, then what is the oneself? What is oneself? And this is really for you to discover. Imagine, say, a circle right here, and call that to be oneself. And then coming off of that circle is a line here, and a line here. And within the area of those 2 points is what we could call your field of awareness. And everything perceivable in your present moment is in that field of awareness. So within that field of awareness, there's thought, there's emotion, and there's your body. And there's also the world, because that's also within your field of awareness. And the relative positions are, for instance, thought, emotions, body, the world. So really everything. And then oneself is this. It's the awareness that is the one that perceives everything that is perceivable. So this is the orientation exercise for you to discover yourself as the awareness. And so all you do is sit. And you could be sitting, or you could be walking. You could do it while doing anything. It's just to be determined and become oriented to oneself as awareness relative to other points, relative to other positions. So this is the awareness exercise. And so we can even kind of just practice it here for a moment. Let's just, you may have been practicing it all along. It really is quite simple. It's literally just being aware of thought as it arises within your field of perceivable phenomenon, within your field of awareness. And within this, we're also aware of our body. We can also become aware of the table, the desk, the computer, the phone at the same time. And you see that in the sheer act of being aware of those things, you know your relative position as the awareness. This is a very subtle discovery, but it is awakening. And what makes this difficult at times is all the thoughts that come in and say, you're doing it wrong, you did that thing yesterday wrong, that person's wrong, that person's right, this source is good, that source is bad. And so all of our attention gets focalized right there at thinking all day long. And so all we're suggesting to do here is to include thinking, but just also expand out to also be aware of our body while thinking is thinking. Even be aware of this table in front of me while thinking is thinking. And when we go from contracted to expanding, then all of a sudden thought becomes just a tool within the field of awareness. And all those crazy thoughts about how you did something wrong yesterday or how this situation should have been different are just thoughts within the totality of something much bigger. Just thoughts within the field of awareness, like we described with that image earlier. Within this field, thought and everything else exists there. So we practice this every day, all the time. We don't need to take time for it out even, or we can. Whatever you want to do. It's just to orient yourself in the moment. To determine the relative position of oneself. Our momentum is very strongly connected to our relative position of oneself being thought. But if we're working to wake up, thought does not wake up. Thought stays sleeping. The experience of thought is sleeping. Awakening is awakening from thought. It doesn't necessarily mean thought stops. That's not necessarily what we're trying to do. We're not resisting or denying or suppressing thought. We're just becoming aware of it. And it's easier to become aware of it as we unravel some of these beliefs. So I think that this awareness exercise, this orientation exercise, will work excellently well with reasoning out some of these beliefs that we all think that are no longer reasonable to believe. So these lessons of reasoning out what is no longer reasonable to believe and this awareness orientation exercise is going to break down that structure that causes our pain and confusion at times throughout the day, throughout our lives. So I look forward to being on this journey with you guys as we unravel and discover and investigate freedom. Okay, so that's the practice. That's the awareness practice or orientation practice, whatever you want to call it. Does anyone have any questions on that? That's an important one. I'm going to wait for a moment to see if anyone has any questions. Does anyone understand it? Does everyone understand it? It's a neat exercise. It's a neat idea. You're simply it's an exercise literally to determine your relative position to yourself. And I've got some of this written down that I'm going to send to you guys afterwards too, to help make it clear in case it isn't clear. Unraveling control, which is what we're going to do in the next lesson here in a moment, is really helpful in discovering how to determine your relative position to yourself. We've got a hand raised here.
I didn't mean to do that.
Oh. Fair enough. Reminds me of Untethered Soul, Paul says. Yes, that's a good book. And Kevin says, I follow you. Good. Kevin says, all good. Great. Cool. I'm going to keep it on that screen in case anyone else wants to put anything in the chat box. Okay, guys. So we're going to go over lesson 1 here in a minute, our first awakening lesson. And we're going to, in this lesson, reason through what is no longer reasonable to believe. This is our first one, and the primary focus is going to be on control and cause. So unraveling those two. And I'll kind of tell you a story of how I came to these conclusions, and it was definitely through my own pain and suffering of trying to cause life to be a certain way for an extended period of time. Thinking life should be a certain way, and so then experiencing resistance or pain or confusion when I knew and know light and clarity and levity is possible. So through these painful experiences, I finally was like, okay, so what must all of this mean? If I've been trying to produce this thing for so long, and it's constantly not happening, and it's constantly the experience of putting out fires, so to speak, or trying to manage a life, then what must all this pain and confusion really be pointing me to? Because I was starting to see that the people in my life weren't wrong for the things that I would prefer they did different ways. Because I was also starting to see that I wasn't wrong for the things that I did that others didn't like and that caused them pain and confusion. So then I started to see that this idea of controlling or causing something to happen and suffering when that didn't happen couldn't have been the best approach for life. And so I started to wonder, what must all of this mean? What greater conclusion are all my experiences pointing me to? And so I sat with that for a while. What greater conclusion are all my experiences pointing me to? Because if I'm experiencing pain, it's because I'm interpreting my experiences at the most surface level interpretations that was passed down to me as reasoning from childhood. It was, right and wrong reasoning is passed down to you at childhood. I'm passing it down to my kids. That's just what you do. You have to. And so, but as an adult though, it's like, what most surface level interpretation must I be using here? In what way am I not being inclusive enough? Bringing in, including more parts of creation and life itself to get a more whole picture of what's actually happening here, instead of the most limited interpretation, instead of the most surface level interpretation of good, bad, right, wrong, and so therefore trying to control or cause things to happen. So this lesson came forth from pain, as every good, as oftentimes realizations do. And so this first lesson is subtitled Reasoning to a Greater Context. And that's really what our painful and confusing experiences are beckoning us to do. Reason to a greater context. What must all of these experiences be pointing me to? So, let's dive into this reasoning through what is no longer reasonable to believe and see what the greater context actually is. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Okay, so awakening. This is lesson 1. Reasoning to a greater context. We're all trying to understand our experiences again and again, whether in relationships or just life circumstances. Things are confusing and painful, plain painful at times. Therefore, when we attempt to understand one of these confusing or painful experiences, we need a more universal way of looking at it. We need a higher perspective that can give us the greater context through which to understand, so we don't continue to hit our heads against the wall, believing and using the same thoughts again and again. To understand how to reason through to a greater context, or as we were saying before, reason through what is no longer reasonable to believe, let's take a look at our own lives. What is it in your life that is bothersome, confusing, painful, or in some way isn't your idea of acceptable. If your human isn't getting what he, she wants, then maybe it's because of how important it is at some level, and just think of your own lives right now, not to be in control right now, for something to move in another direction, in another person's favor. Or maybe it's important for you even, for that unacceptable thing to be in your life right now due to what it will bring later. Maybe still farther. It's not about any of these, but it's about the greater context of how we are actually never the one in control. And our only true control is in how we respond. So right off the bat here, you can see that we're beginning to wash away this idea of thinking about situations. And this ruminating and thinking, just self-talk throughout the day about situations, is really a form of control and the source of a lot of pain and confusion. And so we're moving from that to instead seeing if we're going to call something control, what is our true control? For sure, in a present moment, it's in how we respond. And so already we're setting up a structure in our thinking that is more focused towards each and every present moment than it is trying to control or cause specific outcomes. So let's read on and see what happens next. Let's continue to reason with this thought and see where it leads us. We always need to expand our conclusions out to include others too. If we are not in control, then others wouldn't be in control either, which has its own important implications that we'll investigate more later. But the most immediate question that arises is, if we are not in control, and our control is in our response, then who or what is in control that we are responding to? So you see right here, we're attempting to take the cause or the focus on being an individual. Whenever there's a focus or a cause at being an individual, it's much harder to work with that than if we consider it something else. So let's move a little farther and see what we are considering it to be. So to answer who or what is in control or that we're responding to answer this, to give it some word to continue our deeper exploration, can we call it the divine? If so, we would need to also define the divine to give it more life and dynamic than just being in control. So I use the word divine here, but as the most simplest term, but a more descriptive term could be something like the infinite field of awareness. The infinite field of intelligence. That's a more descriptive phrase that really embodies the divine. But instead of constantly saying the infinite field of intelligence, I think that the divine actually is fitting here. And this gives us a chance to restructure and redefine any thoughts old beliefs or thoughts that we might have of the divine that's been passed down to us from others. So as you can see, what we've done here is we've taken the cause off of an individual as being the one in control and the one doing things, and put it onto the divine. So perhaps we see someone doing something in front of us, and instead of us seeing that they are an immediate cause of something, maybe it's that they are the divine, and that this whole situation is here to bring us to where the divine would take us. So let's read further to clarify that. What we are calling the divine in this context would have to be a precise and perfect coming together of circumstances, or a precise and perfect separating of circumstances. We would also need to reason out a greater context to why the divine would do what we're suggesting it's doing. Why would it cause us pain as it separates something we love from our life, for instance? What would the divine be concerned with? If it was the one causing circumstances in our life, what would it be concerned with? We're really taking the individual out of this, and we're creating something completely different out of our life. What if the divine is only concerned with our greatest benefit? So what if each present moment is only there for our greatest benefit, far beyond what our human can imagine as being of benefit? It's like earlier I was talking about, I was trying to control or corral my life to be this one specific thing that I couldn't get it to be no matter how hard I tried. But what if the moment the whole time was beckoning something even greater than I could imagine that would be of benefit? And I'm going to read on. Maybe this benefit we can call awakening. So maybe that's what's been happening the whole time. Not that I couldn't get my life right, but that's that life was trying to wake me up. And who would do that? Who would have such a grander scheme in mind than something, an infinite intelligence far greater and beyond my own, an infinite field of intelligence? If so, then, it says, the divine, that is the true orchestration of circumstances of the world, would come together and separate based on what will create our greatest clearing of what is no longer needed within us. So these limiting beliefs that we've been talking about, these most surface level beliefs, like right and wrong, cause, opposites, gain, loss. I'm going to read on. Or our greatest cultivation of what is needed within us: love, clarity, freedom, awakening. A divine orchestration for awakening. So as you can see, when we begin to break down the idea that I can manhandle my life into a specific way, and that breakdown usually happens from repeated failure at it again and again. When you finally realize that it wasn't even possible to go in the direction I was going. And what was trying to happen the whole time is these circumstances are arranging in my life constantly in such a way that would awaken me from the most surface level interpretations of what I believed. I'm going to read on. And these are questions. Does this make some of the situations in your life make more sense? I mean, you can even reflect on your situations in your life. The places where pain and confusion are coming up. What if it's not about you forcing life to be the way that you want it to be? What if it's actually about life showing you the places that you're using your most surface level interpretations that came from your reasoning capacity from younger years? And of course, the divine wants to awaken us as it sees as the greatest benefit, which is to relieve us of these limited surface level experiences of life and bring us to something greater. So it's constantly orchestrating circumstances in order to cause this greatest awakening, if we only see it as that benefit. So does this make some of the situations in your life make more sense? Does this give greater purpose to the challenging situations in your life? Can you see how this would change the way you see the challenging situations in your life? Change it from pain and confusion to something greater. This is reasoning to a greater context. This was an example of how to reason through the limited context of your current thoughts and beliefs about ourselves and the world, leading us to a greater context which is inclusive enough to not cause pain and confusion for ourselves and those around us. So if we're causing pain and confusion for ourselves and those around us, it is the limited context in which we are using to reason. And so we're practicing to expand out and be more inclusive in what the possibilities are here. Instead of just that one idea we're trying to manhandle into existence. Instead of just that one idea we're trying to corral people and situations into doing, or even ourselves. So the next paragraph here says, reasoning defined. If this is true, then it must mean blank. So this is reasoning defined. And then to experiment with this conclusion, actively looking for the greater context that you just concluded alive in your life, which leads to greater light. This is a reasoner whom awakens. So I'm going to read this definition of reasoning again. If this is true, then it must mean blank. So for instance, taken in, if all these situations in my life are such as they are, then what must this be pointing to? What must this mean? And when you come to the greater conclusion, then you don't want to, not an ego conclusion of, oh, I'm just never going to get what I want. That's not helpful. That's more nonsense. And so this greater conclusion of what must all this mean? A conclusion that would actually bring more light and freedom to our experience rather than strangle us more, rather than suffocate us more. So this is reasoning. If all this is true, if the situation is as it is, then what must this mean? And so the conclusion I'd come to is that every experience is here to awaken us. Awaken us from those most limiting beliefs, those most surface level interpretations that were passed down to us as a result of having a very young mind as a child. And so each situation in our life now is here to beckon us to awaken from those most surface level interpretations of anyone being right or anything being wrong, of anyone being the cause of anything, of control, of the over-exaggerated idea we have of controlling our life circumstances. When we wake up from the idea of control, then all of a sudden we see the divine in everything. But when we have an over-exaggerated belief in control, we have an over-exaggerated belief in the personhood, and the personality, and the human. And as wonderful and lovely and absolutely precious as it is, there's a lot more parts. And so we're learning to be more inclusive. Whenever pain comes up, it's an indicator. More reasoning, more factors need to be included in our reasoning. When pain and confusion comes up, it's an indicator that we're using some of the most surface level interpretations to understand our experience. And so, what is this moment trying to awaken us to? So this is really what I want the class to be about, is us concluding through our own reasoning what all this must mean. And so, for that reason, here you'll see the other assignment. I told you about the awakening practice that we do all the time. This is the journaling assignment, which I highlighted here. I think you guys can see that. Which says, the question that you journal response to is, what is the greater context alive in my life that I am actively looking for this week? So what is the greater context? So if all this is as it is, what must all this mean? What must the greater context mean? Instead of the most surface level interpretations, what is the greater context? What all this must mean? What is that greater context that all this must mean? That is alive in my life and that I'm actively looking for this week. So I want you guys to journal about that. And it can be related to this lesson 1 here. You writing your own version of this, where you're seeing that, oh, these situations, X, Y, and Z, and this person, in this place, in this situation, is actually orchestrated perfectly for me to wake up from believing that I could possibly have any control over situations that are outside of my control. Or to wake up from believing that anyone is wrong about anything. To wake up from believing that there's one specific cause of anything. So what must these circumstances in my life mean? So this is our journaling opportunity this week. It's for us to figure out, I'm going to highlight this one word here, what the greater context is that we are actively looking for in our life. Is it to see how the control I thought I had was exaggerated? And so the thing that's really in control is the divine, orchestrating circumstances perfectly for me to see what I'm here to awaken from? So that's the journal entry this week for yourself. What is the greater context alive in my life that I'm actively looking for this week? And I would love if you guys could bring it back next week, and if anyone wanted to share it in class, they're more than welcome to. Anyone who doesn't want to share, you don't have to. If you do write it, then please email it to me if you want to, or share it with me in some kind of way if you want to. Or also, if you don't want to, you can just keep it for yourself too, because that's really the point of it. To reason for ourselves. Reason out what is no longer reasonable to believe. And then look, like this question here poses, actively look for that new reasoning to be alive in your life. Like I'm seeing every moment as the opportunity that the divine is perfectly orchestrating for me. I'm excited. Like I'm almost to the point to where like I'm appreciating all these painful emotions that come up when they do come up now. Before it's like, oh shoot, I hope this doesn't happen again. But now it's like, I can't wait for the next one because of how it's going to liberate me even more. I can't wait to discover the next most surface level belief that is dying to come to light. And so I'm seeing the divine everywhere in the form of orchestrated circumstances. So what is it in your life? That's really the reasoning. What is it in your life that you're actively looking for after you've come to the greater context of what all this must mean? Practices this week. There's 3 of them, and of course everyone can do these to the greater or lesser extent that the busyness of their life allows them to do. But my suggestion is to read the lesson every day if possible, and here's the reason why. Read it in the morning, in the evening on a different day, and interestingly, in different moods, to allow the words to influence different perspectives you may have at different times. So this is going to be key for the words on this lesson to really sink in and influence our thinking. Is maybe even right after we had an emotional reaction, maybe at that point read the lesson. Or maybe when we're totally neutral and totally feeling connected with something greater. Maybe that's the point to read it. The point is to experiment with reading it at different times when there might be different perspectives present. So these words can interact with that perspective. That's important. So the takeaway is read it as much as possible. And then the second one here is journaling. So the journaling entry is, what is the greater context? So you would have to reason it out for yourself that's present within your own life, and maybe this lesson can help with that reasoning. But what is the greater context alive in my life that I am actively looking for this week? And then the last thing is the awakening orientation practice, which is what we discussed earlier in class, where we discover, it's just, we determine, it's the determination of our relative position to ourself. Relative to what? And those are parts of the things that you discover. Who you really are as awareness relative to thought, relative to the body, relative to emotions, relative to the world. And so you just orient yourself in that position, which really just might mean as simple as just breathing and being conscious that you're awake in the most simple terms. And you can do that while you're walking, while you're working. You can make specific time to set and do it, however you want to do it. I think that this course will move in you in the ways that it needs to move in you, given exactly what your life is. All right, you guys, that was this week's video. If you liked it, please subscribe. And if you're interested in more, check out the link below in the description for the online class. Most importantly, remember yourself as the one who sees.